Hi, Martha. It's nice to see your face.
Good morning. I will have to step out for a senior project meeting at 10:37 for a little bit, and then I'll be back.
No problem at all. No problem at all. And these are recorded. So anything that you miss is available. It'll be available. I think we'll send it out within a week or so. Or you can send us an email and we'll send you a link. Okay, folks, we've got about another minute and then we will get started. Hi, Sandy. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
All right, it's 9:02, so let's get rolling today. Good morning. I'm Becky Anderson, and I'll be leading you through quite the adventuresome webinar today. This one's going to cover a lot of stuff, so bear with me, okay? A little bit about myself. I've been doing these webinars for a few years. I've got a long history of environmental compliance and safety compliance. I've worked in emergency response, I've worked for state agencies, and I've been a consultant now for quite a long time, and I run a little consulting firm out of Iowa. That's just me. So, and I help a lot of business and industry, but my real heart lies with helping schools make sure that we're mitigating risk from chemical management as much as possible. I want to take a quick minute to say thank you to Vicki Davis out in New Hampshire at Upper Valley Lake Centipede Regional Planning Commission. Vicki is the one that has applied for these grants that have enabled us to do these webinars and provide them to you at no charge. And we will talk about in the next couple of slides, but just to give you a heads up, we do have all the webinars recorded and you are welcome to watch them at any time and pull information off of them. That's the intent. We want to make sure we're sharing good quality information about this stuff. Also want to take just a second and throw up some appreciation to Dave Waddell. Dave was my mentor in this area. He was a phenomenal resource for all of us. We lost him about almost 2 years ago now, and he was just amazingly dedicated at Rehab the Lab and did a phenomenal job of spreading the information and the word across the country about how we need to manage legacy chemicals. The goals for the webinars. Overall goal is to keep you safe and to minimize risk in school districts as it involves chemicals, chemical management, and hazardous waste management. This particular series is focused more on the regulatory requirements that we're under and how all of that meshes together with our actions and how we handle things on a day-to-day basis. And today I'm going to be covering some really in-depth, very difficult to understand stuff. And frankly, I think that the materials we're going to cover today about what is required of your school district, I think that is a major reason why we have not seen really good, solid, continuous progress in the management of chemicals. I think it's because it's really complicated and very confusing. So bear with me today. Give me a little grace if I stumble over my words, okay? Because this is some pretty complex stuff. We are going to spend a lot of time on the chemical hygiene plan. One of the things I want you to note is that I refer to it, and this is just me, as the chemical hygiene lab safety plan. And the reason that I do that is because when I'm talking to schools or industry or anybody else, schools get really confused with the terminology that OSHA uses, which is chemical hygiene plan. Immediately everybody's like, what does this mean? We're teaching our seventh graders to use deodorant or what, what are we doing here with hygiene? This is not a hygiene issue. So because of that language, I throw in lab safety. So when you hear me talk about this, you're going to hear chemical hygiene lab safety plan. It is all the same thing. It's just a little more clear. There's just a little more clarification when I throw in there that lab safety plan. One of the things I also want to talk about today, and I'm going to encourage you to take a look at it, is I've been having a few meetings with the Lab Safety Institute, and they offer phenomenal resources. Many of them are free. Um, Lab Safety Institute has been around for a long time, pretty much as long as I've been doing this, which is a really long time. And they offer a lot of outstanding resources that are free to teachers. And so I would encourage you to take a look at that. And we're going to talk about a little bit. I'll integrate some of their information in as we're moving through the webinar today. One of the things they do an outstanding job with is chemical hygiene plans, or as I call them, chemical hygiene lab safety plans. They also have a chemical hygiene officer certification process, or certification path, and they have essentially a master's class in lab safety. And so take a look at those resources. They're outstanding. Um, they have a whole series of free resources, and then they've also got paid support services. Take a look, try out the free resources, and then see if it's a good fit for you. The big thing that we're going to be talking about today, other than state regulations versus federal regulations, is we're going to talk about looking at all of this from a systems perspective. And one of the things I want you to think about is the life cycle of our chemicals. And this applies to not just laboratory chemicals, but chemicals throughout our entire district. So art chemicals, our career and technical education chemicals, woodworking shop, automotive shop, those types of things, as well as our facilities. And the way that we want to look at those is a complete life cycle of how we're going to manage those chemicals. From when we start with them and procure them, to how we're using them, how we're storing them. And then the big piece that a lot of folks miss is, what do we do when we want to dispose of them? Which are regulated, which are not regulated? How are we going to handle that? And again, that part is very confusing. So we're going to talk about a lot of topics today. I'm hoping to get a lot of your questions answered, but as always, feel free to drop questions in the chat. I will try to address them to the best of my abilities at the end. If I don't know the answer, I'll figure it out and I'll get back with you. And then also wanted to remind you that by participating in these webinars, um, there's a 1 hour meeting time that's a virtual meeting time that's available with me that we can sign up for. I'd like you to wait until the end so that we don't waste your 1 hour of free consultation on something that we're going to cover in one of the webinars. But if you do have an imminent issue going on, you're welcome to reach out, and I'll do whatever I can to help you with that. After that 1 hour time, you're welcome to, I am a consultant. You're welcome to hire me, but that's a conversation for a different day. So here's just some technical tips for Zoom. Again, please, if you've got any questions or comments, use the chat box. All right, quick review from last week. Last week, we defined what legacy chemicals are. If you remember, we talked about what the labels look like, what the containers look like, and why we ended up with this big mess. And by legacy chemicals, I typically am referring to those that are 50, 60, 70 years old that are still sitting on shelves and haven't been used or wanted in decades. In fact, we've found over the years a lot of chemicals from the 1950s and 60s that were purchased, set on shelves, and still have the original plastic seal on the top of them. They've never been opened. This presents a significant number of challenges to school districts from a safety perspective, from a financial perspective, and ultimately from a compliance perspective. So we talked about those. We helped you identify legacy chemicals. Now, a lot of you rushed out and identified that, wow, we do have legacy chemicals. And we heard from a number of you. And I want to say thank you for doing that. I'm also going to say, whoa. Okay, please put the reins on. Please do not touch, pick up, move around, decide to stick in a box and move to a loading dock. None of those things. We've no moving and shaking of the legacy chemicals. Okay, they've been quietly sitting there for decades, not presenting us with significant problems. Some of these are, of course, as I talked about last week, some of them are shock sensitive, friction sensitive, and we just shouldn't pick them up and mess with them. We want to leave them where they're at, identify them, inventory them, and make a plan. Okay, so please, and as I told you last week, I had a high school in Iowa here that helped me out inadvertently with that messaging because they picked out a whole bunch of legacy chemicals, stuck them in boxes, and took them down to facilities with a piece of paper over the top that said, work order, please dispose. And that was all the information there was. We found some shock sensitives in those boxes as we were going through and identifying what was in them. So we have got to have a plan to handle those before anybody does any moving and shaking on them. All right. If you want to learn more and you want to take a look at last year's webinars, these are some of the links. We can send these to you. I know it's impossible for you to see those letters, but no, we have them and we're happy to send those out to you if you request them. Okay, today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to be tough. We are going to do an overview of the OSHA laboratory standard. And I'm going to encourage you at every step of the way that instead of thinking of this as a task list, because again, I work in a family of teachers and principals and teaching coaches. My daughter's a teacher. We have just a 3-generation, 4-generation history of being teachers in our family. And teachers are really, really good at task lists and wanting to check the boxes off of task lists. This is a bigger concept than that. So I need you to bear with me. We need to look at this as a system. And there are some key reasons why, and we'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about what the role of the Chemical Hygiene Officer is. It's a tough role. It's a big role. Most school districts cannot afford to have and hire their own dedicated chemical hygiene officer. It's just not in the cards for a lot of districts, understandably. So where do we go from there? Can we divide and conquer those tasks? Can we have one leader that delegates a lot? There are a lot of different options. The key thing that I've found over the years in working with schools on this is that every school district has a different flavor of how they address this chemical hygiene officer. And it's okay to have different approaches to this. I'm going to also mention again that if you become a chemical hygiene officer and you want to get really good at it and you want to really understand all of the pieces of that puzzle, so as you're putting them together for your district, check out Lab Safety Institute and their chemical hygiene officer curriculum certification program. After we get through some of the regulations that are required both at the state and federal level, the next thing that we're going to talk about is, and this is where this is where I see a lot of hiccups, is we're going to talk about developing a standard operating procedure around purchasing. We want to stop these legacy chemicals from building up. And I've got to be frank, there are schools now that are coming around the second time. Early in my career in the early 2000s, I did a number of chemical school cleanups and helped them to get rid of legacy chemicals. And what I'm finding is we're 20, 25 years later, and I'm starting to get calls from those schools again that says, and those teachers are telling me, well, there's stuff here that I didn't order and it's from 4 teachers ago. We've got to put in some mechanisms at the systems level to eliminate the possibility of legacy chemicals building up. And that includes purchasing policies as well as disposal plans. So those are 2 pieces of the puzzle that have been missing. We're going to talk about those today. And then finally, as we're inventorying and we're identifying our high-risk legacy chemicals, what do we need to include in those? And what are the most common locations that we find highly hazardous chemicals? Again, please, please, please use extreme caution when you're beginning an inventory, particularly if you don't know what the chemicals are in the back of the shelf. All right, please be very careful with that. I am also going to cover a few things. We constantly get questions about, well, what can I throw away? What can I eliminate? So we've got some slides today to go over some generalized guidance on what can be disposed of as non-hazardous solid waste. All right, so we will talk about that today. And we'll talk about an approach on how we start that legacy evaluation, as well as an inventory, not only for an inventory of what you're going to keep, but an inventory of what you're going to dispose of. And there are some reasons that we want to do both of those. Okay, first of all, we're going to start off with, and just jot a little note down here on what your answers are. We want to do a demonstration of competency with this so that any of you that are going to go and request continuing education hours, that you have you're demonstrating your competence. So the first question is, and you may not know the answer to these to start with, but I'm hoping by the end of today, you'll know the answers. First question is, is true or false, is every district required to have a chemical hygiene officer? Second question, true or false, only the science department is required to have a chemical hygiene lab safety plan. Third question, true or false, school teachers and administrators may order whatever chemicals they want for the school. There are no regulatory limits. Okay, so jot down your answers there, and then we'll come back to these at the end of the webinar today. Okay, the next few slides are going to be talking about the differences between federal regulations and state regulations. And this is a very convoluted, confusing system. And my suspicion after talking with a number of teachers is that this is one of the big hangups. We are going to focus exclusively on the federal OSHA lab standard. Okay, this is from the federal OSHA program. And the way that these regulatory programs work, and it doesn't matter if it's EPA or OSHA or any of the other major regulators out there, is that we develop Congress develops requirements, or developed, these have been around for about 40 years, maybe even longer in some cases. It doesn't matter how long it's been around, the pattern is consistent. Congress identifies a risk or a need for a certain set of laws and regulations. Congress passes an act. In this case, Congress passed OSHA's Laboratory Safety Standard Act. Okay. Once the federal government passes that, then it becomes law, and that's where the details of the regulations are written. What is required? And these are requirements at the federal level. So, for example, in Iowa, we do not have a hazardous waste management program. We're the only state in the contiguous US that does not. So our hazardous waste regulations come from the federal government. Now, when we look at OSHA, in Iowa in particular, Iowa has adopted the OSHA regulations for the federal level. So when a state chooses to adopt those federal regulations, there's some deviations that can take place. As long as the state regulations are as stringent as the federal government, so they have to identify as stringent of regulations at the state level as there are at the federal government level, the states may also add on additional state requirements. They have to be as stringent as or more stringent than federal regulations. Now, how does this apply to OSHA and the lab standard? We have some states where they do not have a state OSHA program, and therefore the federal laboratory standard program applies. In fact, that's true in every state. If you don't have a state OSHA program, the federal OSHA program kicks in. So technically, every state is required to have a chemical hygiene lab safety plan. It's part of the lab standard. Some states don't have an OSHA state program, but they have additional state requirements under different departments. New Hampshire is an excellent example of this. New Hampshire does not have an OSHA program. It falls under the federal OSHA program. But the New Hampshire Department of Labor in 2025 passed New Hampshire Ed 320. And if you Google that, what you'll find is that there are more stringent requirements that involve chemical safety in schools, specifically addressing things like storage of flammables, the integration of a chemical hygiene lab safety plan, also not just in the sciences, but also involving art chemicals, career and technical education chemicals, and then there's also additional sections on facilities chemicals. So even though New Hampshire doesn't have OSHA, every time I hear teachers go, well, we don't have OSHA, so we don't have to follow under it. Well, no, you do. You have to follow the OSHA federal plan. And in addition to that, New Hampshire Department of Labor, you have to follow the regulations in New Hampshire Ed 320. I know, clear as mud, isn't it? It just makes my head hurt thinking about all these things. Next option is we have some OSHA states. We have some states that adopt the OSHA federal regulations directly. That's what Vermont has done. So instead of rewriting that code to meet state requirements, they just say, hey, you know what? At the state level, the state OSHA department for Vermont is going to be the enforcer and the inspector, and we're going to adopt the state regulations directly. And then finally, we have some states that adopt the federal regulations and add in several or add in as many as they want of their own specific state regulations in addition to those. So we've really got 4 different options here. And what that means is that to develop and educate you at a nationwide level on the specific requirements for where you are is pretty darn impossible. We can't address all of those specifics in a 1-hour webinar, but I'm going to do the best I can for you. A lot of these regulations have been around for a long time. You are not excluded from falling under them. There are a lot of templates and models for the lab standards chemical hygiene plan or chemical hygiene lab safety plan, as well as the standard operating procedures that plan requires. There are lots of templates out there. Make sure, however, that they are applicable to the state that you are living in. It's critical that you understand what's required in your state. In order to get this right, you're going to have a core team. And again, we want to look at this systemically. We want to look at this at the district level. So while I understand that we have some science teachers that are super enthusiastic and they're going to write a chemical hygiene plan, I love that idea and I love that concept. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover the needs of the district, and there has to be some coordination throughout the district on policies, on standard operating procedures. It's beneficial to the entire district if we identify and we focus on that chemical hygiene lab safety plan at the district level. I kind of think of it in my head like a clock, like one of those really cool old gear clocks. Each of these plans is an individual gear. Each of the people that's playing a role in that is one of the little bitty gears. And in order to really effectively manage this and make that clock seamlessly move forward, each of those gears has to be in alignment. Everybody has to do a small part of it. All right, we're going to do a summary of requirements by state. And this was the Lab Safety Institute and I worked together to develop this. So I want to say thank you to them. This is one of their areas of expertise, and I truly appreciate it. These are complicated enough that this information is complicated enough that I wanted to make sure we had a number of eyes really vet the information. So where are chemical hygiene lab safety plans required? We have certain states, again, that have that state plan. Public schools are covered under the state plans in California, Washington, Michigan, and Vermont. They do require that chemical hygiene lab safety plan. And the other thing that they require is that OSHA permissible exposure limits for chemicals are observed. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today. It's a pretty complex process. What it means essentially is that you cannot be exposed over a certain threshold to certain chemicals that are toxic. And we pay attention to that. And if necessary, we air monitor for that. And if necessary, we conduct medical monitoring if we have exposures. Okay, these are all things that industry has done for years. In these state OSHA programs, states with their own state overseen, state governed OSHA programs, their regulations may exceed the federal OSHA requirements. We have some states that rely specifically on the federal OSHA program. In those cases, public schools are not covered directly. They may be covered by the Department of Labor or some other regulatory entity, but they're not necessarily covered under those the federal OSHA requirements do not include coverage for teachers. Public employees is the way that it's worded. States where that is the case, Texas, Florida, New Hampshire, and Georgia. Now in New Hampshire, there again were additional regulations and requirements, but they were passed by the Department of Labor. So if you're in New Hampshire, one of the sections of code that you need to be familiar with, you need to be familiar with the federal OSHA requirements as well as the more enhanced requirements in New Hampshire Ed 320. And if you simply Google New Hampshire Ed 320, those regulations will come up and you can read them directly. The OSHA permissible exposure limits do not apply. And there are state regulations that may apply instead. In the case of private schools, in all states, there is a requirement for a chemical hygiene lab safety plan because the federal government requires it. And the OSHA permissible exposure limits do apply. And that's because individuals, employees at schools are considered employees. And as a result, they fall under the OSHA regulations at the federal level. So a lot of confusing information right there. The key message from here is you need to know what's right for your state. In order to do that, you need to build yourself a good team. There are a lot of key resources to help you understand this. The name of my company is Hazardous Materials Consulting. I've got some resources. Lab Safety Institute has done this for a long time. They have exceptional resources. And then your state agencies alone will also provide you with guidance and education. And a lot of times they're super helpful when you call in and you say, hey, I'm a school and I'm confused. Can you help me work through this process? So please make sure that you understand the regulations in the state that you're in. We want to see some success with this. We want to see an end to these legacy chemicals. So quality resources is critical. In many states, even if they are not a state OSHA authorized state, there are requirements in other places of code for things like safety data sheet access, training, labeling, and inventories. There's a specific section of OSHA called the Hazard Communication Plan or the Hazard Communication chapter. And I can send you that code citation, but if you want to write it down, if you want to look up what those specific requirements are, if you type into your search engine 29 CFR 1910.1200, those are the federal requirements for the Hazard Communication Program. I would encourage you to take a look at them. Regardless of whether or not you have a state program, it's also a best practice. That's one of the terms you're going to hear me say a lot today. There are some things that I'm going to recommend to you today that even if you are not required to have a chemical hygiene lab safety plan, even if you're not required to have a chemical hygiene officer, I'm going to encourage you that as a best practice to protect you and your students, you want to have these things in place. They're a working map of how to integrate throughout the chemical management system of your district. strategies to make sure that you're successful. Even if they're not required, some of the benefits, if you do write and implement a chemical hygiene lab safety plan, include accumulation of those legacy chemicals. It reduces risk for everybody in the school, students, teachers, administrators, facilities personnel, emergency responders if they have to come in and help you with a spill cleanup. It ensures that your chemicals are actively managed so that we don't have this legacy chemical problem again. And then one of the side benefits that a lot of districts have figured out is it helps you with what I'm going to call economies of scale. If we have a hazardous waste, every time we have a hazardous waste company come in and do a chemical cleanup, not only do they charge for disposal of those chemicals, but they also charge for transportation to get the truck there, fuel surcharges, personal protective equipment, chemist time. There's a whole series of charges that are just flat fee charges right up front at the beginning before the truck even gets to your site. Instead of paying that multiple times, if we can coordinate district-wide and look at this as a system management issue, we can minimize a lot of those transportation fees, a lot of that chemist time, a lot of those additional expenses. So it really does become much more affordable if we all work together. And this is different than most schools operate. Many of the schools that I've worked with over the years operate where departments operate very autonomously. So the science teachers might do a clean out, and then the woodworking shop might do a clean out. If we work together systematically at a systems level, we're going to achieve management, safe management of chemicals a lot more effectively and a lot more affordably. Key message, even if you're not required to have one of the chemical hygiene lab safety plans, it's really in your best interest to write it and implement it. So where do we start with this? Start by taking a look at that chemical hygiene, or excuse me, start by taking a look at the lab standard. When you read the lab standard, and anytime that you read regulations, they're confusing. They're worded way differently than most normal language. Okay, so you kind of have to put yourself in that mindset. The lab standard is located in 29 CFR 1910-1450. If we can start understanding the different pieces and parts of that, we can start building them again at that system level. So I'm going to encourage you, if you've written a chemical hygiene lab safety plan just for your science room, science department, please consider expanding it and working with a team that is across all areas that work with chemicals within your district, so that we can get that systematic approach moving forward. School policies do have to be, the standard operating plans and the policies do have to be site specific. So they do have to be how each individual school is going to operate. We can put those details in the appendices, though, of that lab standard, in the appendices of that lab chemical hygiene lab safety plan. Once the policies are developed, it's really, once they're implemented the first time, then it's just a matter of maintaining them and following them every year, the way that you do with all procedures in school. Just last week or 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, when I was helping the school that did an impromptu clean out before they'd had any education, the one where we found the shock sensitive materials. One of the things that was interesting to me was we went to a safety committee meeting. That was a district safety committee meeting after we evaluated what chemicals were brought down to the facilities area. And in that safety meeting, one of the participants said, it's just crazy that we don't have a policy for waste disposal and chemical management. We have a policy for everything else in our district. And again, I think it's because I think we don't have those because it's really confusing what we have to operate under to meet the state requirements where we're at. So we're going to really work hard to try to move this forward and understand how we can help all areas of the school engage in chemical safety. All right, there, I also put on this slide a couple of other OSHA requirements. And again, if your school is operating under federal OSHA, these would be requirements for you. There's the chemical hygiene plan that's defined in 29 CFR. 29 CFR stands for the 29th chapter of the Code of Federal Regulations. That's what CFR stands for. 1910 is the general industry section. 1910-1450 specifically addresses the lab standard. Personal protective equipment is identified in 29 CFR 1910-130 to 134. And the hazard communication, which addresses things like safety data sheets and inventories and training and education, is identified in 29 CFR 1910-1200. Those are three critical program areas that you're going to want to be familiar with. Now, back to the OSHA lab standard, and this is at the federal level. So remember, your state may even have more rules than this. But at the federal level, there are several academic lab requirements. And these are the specific pieces that the laboratory standard addresses. It applies to employees that are engaged in laboratory use of hazardous chemicals. Now, that always trips a lot of people up. If it's a laboratory, then it really only applies to like biology and chemistry, right? No, not necessarily. We've seen some states that have expanded that laboratory definition to include things like art studios. They're working hands-on labs where students are learning trades and techniques. A woodworking shop, under the right definition, could be considered a working laboratory. So this doesn't necessarily just apply to laboratory as in science laboratory. It requires the development and implementation of the chemical hygiene plan. And again, I refer to that as the chemical hygiene lab safety plan, which includes designation of a chemical hygiene officer. It requires employers to ensure exposures are maintained at or below permissible exposure limits. We don't want you exposed to chemicals. We don't want you sniffing the formaldehyde, okay? Please, 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 please. We want to make sure that we're mitigating your risk and your students' risk by managing exposures. It defines the requirements for employee education and training and information and training. It establishes criteria of when we implement medical monitoring based on exposures. It requires a hazard determination and implementation of control measures. A hazard determination is essentially evaluating chemicals to determine, is this something that we should have within a school district? And there's a lot of that needs to be defined. And we'll talk about that when we get to our purchasing standard operating procedure policy. It addresses the use of respirators and it defines record keeping requirements. So these are all pieces and parts of that systems approach that is outlined and defined in the OSHA laboratory standard. It includes a non-mandatory best practices section. It's called Appendix A. Now, where do you find this stuff? You can look up the OSHA laboratory standard online just by putting into your search engine 29 CFR 1910-14.1450. That's where that lab standard is located. I have a reference manual from Mancom that I use. Now, one of the things that gives me hope, okay, this is really overwhelming. That's a big list of items. I'm going to tell you, I pulled out my Mancom lab standard. You can buy the Mancom book, but honestly, the information is free online. All you have to do is type it into your search engine and you can read the specific requirements. I like the Mancom books because it gives me some cheat sheets in the back of how to implement things best. In the Mancom book, this section of code is 3 pages long. It's not much. So that gives me some hope that, okay, if I take it a line at a time, a paragraph at a time, and try to put my plan together, I'm going to get through this. I can do it. It just takes small increments of effort to get through. So it's that old adage, Desmond Tutu shared with us of how do you eat an elephant? A bite at a time. Key message, this chemical hygiene lab safety plan provides you with a roadmap, a comprehensive system on how to manage chemicals safely to protect employees and to protect students. When you're building your district chemical safety team, and this is going to take some time and some effort, please be sure that you identify where chemicals are used throughout the district and include key individuals from each of those different areas. You may have a chemical safety team at the district level, and then each school may have a chemical safety team. Does this have to be separate from your regular safety committee? No, can be the same group of people. Just going to be a little bit slightly different focus when we're working on chemical safety. One of the key roles here is that chemical hygiene officer, and that chemical hygiene officer for you is going to branch both the district level safety committee, safety personnel, as well as the school safety personnel. That chemical hygiene officer is going to have to go back and forth between them. So a lot of times what we see is that this is a facilities manager at the district level, and then they delegate a lot of activities to individuals on the various either district or school safety committees that are meeting. At the district level, we want to make sure that we've got at a minimum persons from facilities, from curriculum development, from purchasing, and then possibly from your security or your risk management team. I think it's a good idea to include them. At the school level, that's where we address individual departments. Science departments, facilities, art department, career and technical education departments or department. The chemical hygiene officer, and this is OSHA's definition at the federal level. This is a designated employee, so it has to be an employee. You cannot subcontract out your chemical hygiene officer. I've had that question several times over the years. Well, yeah, that would be really super great if you could do that. It's not close enough to the action, and OSHA requires it to be an employee. Has to be a vested person. By vested, I mean a person with an enhanced interest in making sure the school is safe. It doesn't have anything to do with tenure. Sorry, I shouldn't have used that word. That was a little confusing. So we want to make sure that the chemical hygiene officer is an employee, that they are qualified by training or experience. And that's all the guidance that OSHA gives us on what their training requires. There is no certification that's required. However, it's a complex enough position. I'm going to encourage you to get a certification or at least take some enhanced classes. It provides technical guidance on chemical safety and risk management. And then it coordinates across departments within the school and across departments at the district level. The core function of the CHO is to provide that connection point between that larger system approach and each individual school and how all those departments operate. What's technical guidance? What does that mean? This person has to know how to read and interpret a safety data sheet, and they have to understand hazard information. They have to understand exposure limits and exposure controls, things like working fume hoods, safety showers, eye wash stations, ventilation over automotive paint booths, ventilation in art departments if we're using ceramic glazes, those types of things. This person needs to have an understanding. Those are called control measures under OSHA. This person, the chemical hygiene officer, has to support risk assessments and develop SOPs, and they have to be versed enough that they can advise on personal protective equipment, storage, and waste management. Again, that chemical hygiene officer serves as a strong coordinator to manage all of the chemicals in the district as one system, not as individual separate programs. The CHO may be assigned within a curriculum or a safety or facilities role. However, their effectiveness is critically dependent upon their ability to coordinate across departments And then also maintain visibility of all chemicals in use and in storage. And I'm going to add in and in purchasing. Without this coordination, everything becomes fragmented. We end up with chemicals building up, and we end up with those legacy chemicals again. We've got to prevent that from happening. All right. Key activities of the Chemical Hygiene Officer. They guide the process of the Chemical Hygiene Lab Safety Plan development and implementation, coordination and communication. They also help with developing standard operating procedures, which is a requirement of the Chemical Hygiene Lab Safety Plan under federal OSHA. They conduct audits and do annual plan updates. They coordinate engineering controls, evaluations of things like fume hoods and safety showers to make sure they're in working order. They oversee training, management of the safety data sheet databases, and they oversee the coordination of waste management. And again, we want to coordinate that waste management not only for regulatory compliance, but also so that we can take some advantage of economies of scale when we're doing those waste cleanouts. We'll have upcoming webinars to talk in detail and help you build that chemical hygiene lab safety plan. We've got 2 webinars specifically designed to how the heck do we write and implement one of these. So we will help you with that in the upcoming webinars. If you're wanting to get ahead of it, check out Lab Safety Institute. They've got a great program. So last webinar, we worked again to identify legacy chemicals. A reminder again, please don't start moving them and shaking them. Okay, they've been sitting nice and quiet and not really doing much except becoming more dangerous over the years. We want to just leave them in place until we have a plan. And then the kicker is we've got to get that plan implemented. We can't just leave them sit for another 5 to 10 years. I just had a really weird experience about that. I went out to a school that I cleaned out 20 years ago. And when I was doing the laboratory cleanouts as part of Rehab the Lab 20 years ago, one of the things that the team and I did is we used white or yellow wax markers. And we would take the wax marker and put a big X on the back of the chemical bottle so that you could clearly identify that it needed to be disposed of. Just 2 weeks ago, I found 3 containers with big X's on them. They've been sitting around in a district for 20 years after I encouraged them to get rid of them 20 years ago. We've got to do better with this. We have to do better with this. Keep in mind that the webinars that we're offering and that you're participating in offer up to an hour of free assistance. So if you run into any major problems immediately, please implement that free 1 hour, and it's at the district level. I know all of your little brains are ticking going, okay, if I make 10 people in the district listen to this, does that mean we get 10 hours? No, I'm sorry, I'm one person. So bear with me, 1 hour per district. Once we develop that plan, identify those legacy chemicals and get rid of them, how do we prevent this? One of the things we're going to finish talking about or talk about today is implementation of a standard operating procedure for purchasing. This is one of the big things that's been missing. To write a standard operating procedure is a requirement of the federal OSHA laboratory standard. Those standard operating procedures have to be kept with that chemical hygiene lab safety plan. If you already have a standard format in your district for writing procedures, perfect. Implement that. If you don't have one, Google or use your search engine to find a good template that you like, implement it. It's a great use of artificial intelligence, of AI. Build me a template that will meet the OSHA Federal Chemical Hygiene Plan lab standard for standard operating procedures. Another place to look, our SOPs are frequently posted on university websites, and many universities are a lot farther ahead in chemical safety management than K-12s are. So I would encourage you to take a look at those too. The kicker is when you download one of those and make it your own, it has to be customized to your school, your district, your chemicals and your procedures. So you can use the format in the template, but you've got to make it your own. OSHA doesn't define what the standard operating procedure has to look like. It just has to be, and I quote, relevant to the safety and health considerations to be followed when laboratory work involves the use of hazardous chemicals. Again, you've got to also understand your state specific requirements. Considerations, start with the chemicals that are required as part of the curriculum. At the district level, we want to get those curriculum writers involved in this, because if they're requiring a certain lab be completed as part of a curriculum, we need to look at those chemicals and make a determination. Are we requiring chemicals that are appropriate in K-12s? Or are we going to be doing some labs that really are involving chemicals that we don't have safety measures in place to use? One of the key things that comes to mind here is biology specimens. We've got to make absolutely certain that we're not exposing our students and teachers to formaldehyde from biological specimens. OSHA defines a permissible exposure limit for formaldehyde. We've got to make sure. And I would encourage you not to fall for the marketing that some of our specimen suppliers use. Make sure if something says that it's formaldehyde free, that you look at the safety data sheet and you verify that formaldehyde is not used in the process. If there's formaldehyde used in the process, there's going to be some residual formaldehyde. Please make sure that you're not exposing yourself or your students. If you have to do something like a biology dissection with a specimen and it does have formaldehyde in it, then you need to have a working fume hood so that it pulls those vapors away from yourself and your students. That's just one example. So we want to look at the curriculum, see what chemicals are required, and then we want to evaluate them. Key strategies for safe purchasing include considering the development of a list of those chemicals in a standardized shareable form so that everyone can download safety data sheets. If we have an unusual chemical, and this always comes up too, what if I have a special little experiment that I saw on TikTok that was super cool and I want to do it in my classroom? Can I just order one of those chemicals? I'm going to encourage you to make chemical purchasing part of your district plan and your chemical safety committee plan so that your chemical hygiene officer has the ability to evaluate those safety data sheets before you get those chemicals ordered and delivered. It's very easy for us to get excited about a really cool fireball, giant, cool, burn the ceiling tiles a little bit experiment to engage our students. Not necessarily the smartest thing to do for us, for our safety or for our students' safety. So if you are going to work outside of the curriculum, you will need to develop a list of those chemicals that you want to use, and they really should go through that same purchasing policy, the standard operating plan that you're going to develop that governs how chemicals are purchased. Make sure that you evaluate the safety data sheet to see what the risks are associated with the chemical, and make sure that you understand how you're going to dispose of that chemical, any excess or post waste from your experiment. I would suggest that for anything that's unusual like that, the safety committee develop a form for a unique chemical purchase form. Call it something like that. And there are a lot of them available as templates. Then make sure that your purchasing committee evaluates those. A purchasing SOP, standard operating procedure, really needs to educate and guide employees on the following items. We need to have someone make a final decision Typically, it's going to be either the safety committee or the chemical hygiene officer on whether or not that chemical is safe enough to be used in the application that a teacher wants to use it. And within a classroom, do we have all of the necessary chemical safety engineering controls in place? If we're going to order an organic solvent that has a real high toxicity level, can we use it under a working fume hood? If we don't have a working fume hood, we should not be using that chemical. Clear things to identify in your standard operating procedure for purchasing include who on the safety committee is going to evaluate these, who authorizes this, and then who orders that chemical. Does the teacher order it? How do they order it? Who receives the chemical and where? I have a lot of chemicals that are delivered to administrative offices. Those administrative personnel have no idea what they're handling. Is that really the smartest way to do it? Do we need to provide those administrative assistants that are receiving chemicals education on what they're receiving and what to look out for? Who verifies that the safety data sheet has been collected? Who adds this to the inventory that's required as part of that chemical hygiene lab safety plan and as part of your hazard communication plan? And then who places the chemical in storage? What are all the different roles that are involved in purchasing and bringing in those chemicals? Guidance for the chemical hygiene officer and the safety committee include evaluation of chemicals and what criteria are you going to use? There is no rule. There are no rules federally prohibiting certain chemicals in school. And this is one of the things that's really appalled me for years and years. We don't have any limitations on that. Examples of things that we really should include on that forbidden list: acutely toxic items such as potassium cyanide. I've found it in a number of schools. I've never found anybody that's actively using it or identified any appropriate use for it to even have it in a school. Explosives, or things that when they sit around for a long time and dry out become explosive, like picric acid. Again, maybe in the 1950s and 60s we used it as a biologic stain. We don't do that anymore. Things that are peroxide formers, such as ethyl ether. And I'm going to add in isopropanol. That was one that really shook me up a couple of years ago. Make sure your isopropanol is not more than about 2 years old. It is another chemical that can form peroxides. Peroxide formers can become shock sensitive, friction sensitive, and photosensitive potential explosives. And I hate using that word, but it's the truth. We want to think about highly corrosive chemicals, things like fuming sulfuric acid and hydrofluoric acid. Those present an exceptionally high level of risk. Do we really need them? Do we want them? Or do they need to be included as part of our purchasing policy of things we don't bring in? And then highly reactive chemicals, air reactives, water reactives, things that if we mix them wrong or handle them wrong can develop highly reactive, dangerous components. Things like sodium azide, metallic sodium, metallic potassium, white phosphorus, all of those high-risk things. We want to also consider best practices. Even if we don't put something on a forbidden list, if we're going to bring it in, we need to make sure that we're identifying all the risks ahead of time. For example, if the chemical requires special storage and disposal, do we have the means to do that? One of the key things that I see is storage of acids and bases. I can't tell you how many times I've opened a poly corrosives cabinet, a plastic corrosives cabinet, and seen ammonium hydroxide sitting right next to acetic acid. Bad combination. The integrity of the glass is impacted. We get exterior contamination. We get interior contamination. We get a lot of big problems. And when I ask the teachers, why are you storing your concentrated acids next to your bases? Well, I only have one acid. I only have one corrosives cabinet, so I just put all the corrosives in there. Not a good practice at all. If you're going to have concentrated acids and you're going to have highly corrosive bases, you need to have 2 separate corrosives cabinets. If they require special disposal, toxic metals, These are metals that are regulated by either EPA or state agencies. I'm going to read the ones to you that are regulated at the federal level by EPA. If you have chemicals that contain arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, lead, mercury, selenium, or silver, those cannot be disposed of down the drain. They cannot be thrown in the trash. Those are regulated at the federal level by EPA and at the state level by most states. Does this mean that they're forbidden? No, absolutely not. It means that you have to have a disposal plan in place. You have to understand how you're going to handle those. Flammable solvents is another one. We need to make sure if we have flammable solvents, EPA defines that as having a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. If we have flammable solvents, we need to have them and store them in a flammables cabinet. And then we've got others, metal containing compounds, that may be regulated at either the state or even at the local level by your publicly owned wastewater treatment works. And those include chemicals with copper and zinc and nickel. And I know we have a ton of folks that are using chemicals that contain copper, zinc, and nickel and don't necessarily think of them as regulated. Well, Becky, I'm dumping it down copper pipes. How is that a thing? Well, I'm telling you, your local wastewater POTW, your wastewater treatment plant, may have regulations in place that say, hey, we don't need any more copper in our system. Don't dump it down the drain. So you need to have identification that these are regulated materials, and you need to build in to that SOP for purchasing. How are we going to handle them when we decide to get rid of them? What is our waste disposal process? Again, another nod to those unique considerations. What if something is on the forbidden list, or what if something is regulated? We want to pull some strategies from the business world. First, we want to acknowledge that this is usually a pretty small percentage of chemicals. So it's not like we have to identify and build SOPs for something that's going to impact 150 chemicals on your site. Not the case. So because it's usually a small amount, we can put into place a specific SOP that says, you know what? If it's a regulated chemical, either because it's flammable or because it's a heavy metal or a regulated metal, or because of some other consideration, it presents extra risk. We'll have the chemical hygiene officer identify that. And then if it's something that's super risky, let's say we've got an AP student and they want to play around with white phosphorus because it's cool. Okay, a little bit toxic, stupid, dangerous, incredibly, incredibly risky for a school because of its air reactive nature, the fact that it burns through concrete, and off gas is an acutely toxic gas. If we have something like that that comes up and we have a student and a teacher that are like, you know what, we really need this. I can remember years ago, I had a student that was very interested in aflatoxin, and he wanted to order in aflatoxin to see how it worked in a biological system. Acutely toxic biotoxin. And what we have to do at that time is we have to look at a full cost evaluation. That's one of the first places businesses start. What's it going to cost us to put in place all of the PPE, personal protective equipment, and engineering controls, things like hoods? I mean, do we need a laminar flow hood for this one experiment and this one student? And if it's going to cost a lot of money to do that, it might not be worth it. In those instances, you may want to call in some resources, phone a friend, ask for outside evaluation, work with a local university. Expertise can also come from insurance and risk managers. It can also come from Lab Safety Institute and various resources that are available to you on the internet, such as Fire Code. Chemical Safety Board also is a free resource and has outstanding resources for you. And finally, we need to have a specific decision maker. Whether that's the chemical hygiene officer or maybe it's the administrator for that Maybe it's the school administrator that's responsible for that particular building. If we have something that really, we've got a number of students that really want to do that does present high risk, is there a local lab that already has engineering controls that we can coordinate with? Nobody wants to say no, but at the same time, we have to consider risk versus reward and education when we're talking about chemical risk. Once this purchasing SOP is in place, we can implement this and we can implement additional best practices if we want. And what we'll find is that we've got easier management of that safety data sheet system as well. Are all the challenges resolved with this? No, unfortunately, there are additional challenges that remain. So even if we have a good, robust purchasing system, there are still going to be other challenges. How do we prevent these legacy chemicals from building up again? Well, this is a little trick that I had a science teacher show me years ago, and I love it. I still love it to this day. Okay, it's a great day in your lab. All of your legacy chemicals are gone. Now you're just, you walk into your stock room and it's just the stuff that you and your colleagues use. Woohoo! We're in really good shape. Awesome. Are we done? No. Purchasing policy seems to be working. But how do we know when we change out teachers every couple of years, because people move in and out of jobs, how do we know if somebody's still using that? Simplest method going, work with your colleagues and say, you know what, everybody, when you pull a chemical out of the stockroom to use it, everybody this year, this is the year of the yellow dots. We're going to put a yellow dot on the top of that, a little tiny eighth of an inch yellow dot, not an eighth of an inch, that would be too small. Let's say three millimeters. A 3 millimeter little dot on the top of that chemical bottle. And if you've used it this year, that we've got the yellow dots. Next year, we'll use green dots. Year after that, we'll use red dots. We get to the end of 3 years and we look at that chemical and we don't have any dots on the top of it. We know nobody's touched it in 3 years. Instead of letting it continue to sit there, we automatically identify it as waste disposal. It doesn't have to be 3 years. It can be 5 years. It's whatever works for your specific applications. I would really advise against going more than 5 years with chemical shelf storage. You can buy these dots from Fisher Scientific, costs $182 for 5,000 dots. Or you can go to the Walmart website or one of your local box stores and buy 4,200 dots for about $10. So for $10, you're covered for the next 3 years in identifying what's been used. The most critical SOPs that safety committee needs to be putting into place and that chemical hygiene officer needs to help draft are policies, standard operating procedures that work around quantity management, regular evaluation of container integrity, spill prevention, chemical age management, waste collection, and then labeling of solutions. If you can get those 6 SOPs written and in place, working with your chemical hygiene plan, and this goes for all areas of the school. This would be including art teachers and CTE teachers, facilities managers. You can use the same strategy throughout the entire district. Once we get those in place, we'll be able to know how old those chemicals are. Lots of sources of hazardous waste in schools. We've got hazardous waste that's coming out of sciences, art, CTE, facilities, bus barns. This is just a rough overview. That chemical safety committee needs to address all of these different areas. Now we're going to get into the what can I throw away section of things. All right. So bear with me on this. Okay. This is tough. We're going to start with just some generalized rules. You need to know the regulations for the state that you're in specifically. However, rule of thumb, simple rules. If a chemical is flammable, toxic, environmentally hazardous, explosive, radioactive, corrosive, if it's an oxidizer, if it's a gas cylinder, a flammable solid, a water reactive, or an air reactive, you can't throw it away, evaporate it up the hood, or dump it down the drain. And if you need me to email that list to you, make a little note, send me an email and say, hey, what was that list of the simple rules of chemicals that require special management? Additional no-nos. Once you figure out that you have excess chemicals that you want to get rid of, even if they're not legacy chemicals and really old, you just have extra and you don't want them around. Please do not sell them on internet sites. Do not send them home with students or teachers. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've gotten calls from particularly college professors that have taken things home and built labs in their basement. And all that does is leave a really big, expensive mess for your relatives to clean up. Don't take them home and use them. Don't donate them to museums or other schools. If you don't have a need for them, they probably don't have a use anywhere else. Highly likely. Don't gift them to colleges or universities. They don't want them. In fact, almost all of them now have policies in place that say, hey, we don't accept donations. And don't hide them. Don't hide them in the backs of cabinets. I had one school that actually hid them in a wall and then built a wall around them. I had some schools that have put them up in the upper areas above ventilation systems. Not all of these are violations of regulation. They're just bad practices. Where do we find the really bad stuff? A lot of times those peroxidizable chemicals are found in flam cabinets, and they're usually in the way back of the cabinet. I would recommend strongly that you, if you do have legacy chemicals, that you download and familiarize yourself with which ones can form explosive peroxides over the years. You've got to keep an eye out for those. Another high hazard that we see, alkaline earth metals, particularly potassium and sodium. Those are usually stored with organic ones. A lot of times, for some reason, I find them on the bottom of shelves. They're usually wooden shelves or metal shelves, and they're way in the back. Explosives, when dry or contaminated, including things like picric acid and sodium azide, typically find those in collections of biological stains. Sometimes they're labeled O1 and they're included with organic acids, or they're in alphabetical order. Peroxidized isopropanol. A lot of times I find those in squirt bottles. And it'll test positive for peroxides if it sits around longer than 2 to 3 years. Reactive oxidizers, things like peroxides, nitrates, nitrites, and oxidizers, those are usually stored in inorganic class I3, or they might be in alphabetical order. Those are the primary areas that I see the highly hazardous chemicals. Once you decide that you have high hazards and you decide to get rid of them, and you also identify chemicals in excess, the other thing that I want you to do is you're going to take that list of things that's required for your curriculum that you are using very slowly. You're going to take those chemicals that you are using in use that are in good shape and find a location that you can store them as you're conducting your chemical clean out. This is the Flynn system of chemical storage. It is free on the Flynn Science website. Flynn is a supplier of chemical stock chemicals. They have a really good labeling system, and this is how they recommend that you store stock chemicals. So you can start by clearing off a couple of shelves. You're going to need 4 shelves. Typically, we put organics on one side of the room and inorganics on the other side of the room. But what I really want you to notice here is after most legacy chemical cleanouts, the yellow highlighted chemicals, schools are not using those. So for example, inorganic class 10s, which Flynn identifies as sulfur, phosphorus, arsenic, and phosphorus pentoxide, nobody is using those. So that entire shelf is empty. Shelf 2, sulfates, sulfites, thiosulfates, phosphates, acetates, oxalates, and iodides are being used. So you need to have an I2 shelf for inorganic class 2s. What's not being used are halides, halides, halogens, phthalates, and oleates. It leaves you extra room. And what I would recommend is when you're identifying by class, once you get things identified by shelf, then you alphabetize them, because then we can alphabetize because all of those chemicals are compatible together. Shelf 3, I3, nitrates, nitrites. What we don't usually use is amides or azides. So this entire, and I'm happy to share this with you if this would help you. So here's the layout for shelf 1. Shelf 2, here's the layout for shelf 2. Again, look at that. Once we eliminate all those yellows because nobody's using them in their curriculum, we end up with a lot of shelf space. I can't tell you how many times I walk into a stock room and it is just loaded front to back. And you have to sort through 27 different bottles to get to the one thing you want. This eliminates that. And it makes your stockroom so much easier to manage. Organics, same thing. We're going to manage some of them. Now, I will tell you that a lot of your organics are going to end up in the flame cabinet. But we have to make sure, again, that we're storing them appropriately by chemical class. Flynn does a really nice job of laying that out for you. You're going to do an even better job because you're going to get rid of all the stuff that's highlighted in yellow because you're probably not using it. And you won't miss it. It's kind of crazy. Shelf 2 for organics. Look at that. Hardly anything that we're keeping. Take a look at that free resource on Flynn's website. If you want additional information, send over an email and I'll share these with you. When you are starting your clean out and you're evaluating what you want to keep, please, and I've never done this in a webinar before, and I'm telling you, right now I am getting really scared about this. I'm nervous about this. But this is how you're going to conduct your own inventory of what chemicals you need to dispose of. And the reason that we want to inventory them is that that will allow you to take that inventory and send it out to hazardous waste vendors so that you can get multiple quotes. And again, remember, we're not going to do this as a department. We're going to work systematically through the school to identify what that clean out looks like so we can get multiple bids and hopefully we can use that economies of scale to minimize our costs some. I also get a lot of questions about what does a standard legacy chemical clean out cost. There are a couple of key things that you can do to minimize the cost. One is, of course, work together at the district level. Reduce the number of stops that hazardous waste company needs to make. Second thing you can do, there are some chemicals that you can throw away or dump down the drain. The next slide will go through that. You can also potentially work with a household hazardous waste collection facility in your area. It's something definitely to investigate. So keep an eye out on that. What does it cost? The largest legacy chemical cleanout that I conducted was at a university. It was probably 15, 20 years ago. And it was about $65,000. Okay, before you freak out, that was very atypical. On average, I think you can plan to spend somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on the number of containers that you have that need to go away. Now, I know that just shocked all of you science teachers. We don't have that kind of budget. That's why we need to coordinate with facilities. And it's not an all or nothing thing. We can actually prioritize and get rid of some and then continue to evaluate the others for use. Go slow. Take this as a step-by-step, baby step to compliance approach. Start with a shelf at a time. Start with the easy things like the O3s and the I9s. Learn what those mean. Start with the least hazardous classes so you kind of understand the process. Use a buddy system. This is not a one-person job. Make sure you have adequate personal protective equipment. And I would encourage you to invest in an intrinsically safe flashlight. That's a non-sparking flashlight. It lets you get into areas where we may potentially have vapors more safely. Intrinsically safe flashlights, you can buy them on some of the big online suppliers for about $10. You want absolutely minimal movement. And if you don't recognize the chemical, don't touch it or move it. If the label is gone, don't touch it or move it. If the glass looks etched or compromised, don't touch it or move it. And if it's eaten its way through the container and through the lid into the shelving, or it's contaminated its neighbors, don't touch it or move it. It's critical for you to understand the regulations where you're at. Things that can be thrown away. So one of the first things that I do when I'm helping a school is we get rid of all the extra stuff that's non-hazardous. It just makes you feel like you've accomplished something. Inevitably, schools will have household food ingredients that they're using for labs. If those are old and compromised, get rid of them. Clean that shelf off. Those food can be thrown away. Please don't throw multivitamins away. I know that sounds crazy, but some of them have high enough selenium levels that they're regulated. But food products can be thrown away. Some examples of non-hazardous solids that can be thrown away with no threat that are not regulated. Sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, sodium chloride, table salt, magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salt, potassium chloride, which is the no salt alternative, calcium carbonate, plaster Paris, calcium sulfate, gypsum, kaolin, which is clay, and sand. All of those things are non-hazardous solid waste. You can get rid of them. Augers, biological media, and starches. Those can all be thrown away. Sugars like fructose, glucose, sucrose, those mannose, those can all be thrown away. Polyethylene beads, dry resins, those can be thrown in the trash. Inevitably, I come across schools and they've got 150 vials of pH paper that's really old. Those can be thrown away in the solid waste. There's no use for them. And then using your best practices and your strategies, things like old papers and instruction manuals, empty stopper bottles, the little stopper bottles that the rubber stoppers on the top are all gooed up and sunken in. Those can all be thrown away. Dioramas, old projects, dioramas, models, stuff that takes up space that you're not using needs to be thrown away. And kits that have been used up. If there's residual chemical in them, keep them and store the chemicals appropriately until disposal, but throw the kits away. All of these things will give you more room to work and provide you with a safer, cleaner chemical stockroom. The benefits of this, it keeps you safe and you identify, and really keeping you safe and your students safe, that's really the only thing that we're focused on here. Yes, regulatory compliance is very important, but we've got to keep you and your students safe. A lot of hazardous waste companies charge by the pound for fees. If they're non-hazardous, you don't want to have a hazardous waste company take them away, because then you're just expending money on stuff that can be thrown in the trash. By building this inventory, it allows you to get multiple bids. You can certainly just pull the trigger, hire a company, come in and say, hey, take it all. I've had school districts do that before. I don't want any of it. We're going to start all new. Come in, take it all. That is a very, very expensive approach. Doesn't have to be that way. Understand that more waste that is identified and generated needs to be managed. So that list of those chemicals, the compounds of metals that are regulated, if you're going to use those, if you're going to use some barium sulfate, if you're going to use potassium dichromate, you've got to understand that that's regulated, and how are you going to dispose of it in an ongoing manner. Coordination at the system level is critical with this. Coordination with your district is critical with this. EPA at the federal level does allow a one-time cleanout. They call it an episodic generation event. Not all states have adopted it at this point. But if your state has it, you can do one of those large-scale cleanouts. One of the super amazing options that you need to look into are those household hazardous waste facilities. Now we're really running out of time. I apologize for running us right to the end today, but we covered a lot of information. Answers to our demonstration of competency. Is every district required to have a chemical hygiene officer? Yes, that's true. Every district is required to have a chemical hygiene officer. Even if you have a state OSHA program, remember the state program has to be as stringent as or more stringent than the federal program. So you have to have a chemical hygiene officer. True or false, only the science department has to have a chemical hygiene plan. That one is funky. That's a depends on what state you're in. Sometimes it's just the science department. In the case of New Hampshire Ed 320, the chemical hygiene plan addresses additional departments. So that's a state dependent answer. True or false, school teachers and administrators can order whatever chemicals they want. There are no regulatory limits. Unfortunately, that's true. We can have teachers that order whatever they want. And I've seen some mistakes over the years. Steps today that you can take. Work to begin establishing that chemical safety committee or a group of chemical technical people that can be included in your district or your school safety committee. Begin to identify who's going to be that chemical hygiene officer. Learn the regulations that are applicable to your state. And if you do begin that legacy chemical inventory, above all, stay safe and go very slow. A shelf at a time, a half a shelf at a time. And then plan to attend our next webinar in 2 weeks. And I look forward to seeing you then. Vicky, are there any questions? Here is my email and my contact information. Please keep in mind I am one person. So if it takes me a little bit of time to get back to you, bear with me on that. Vicky, are there any
Yeah,
questions?
there was a question about where to get school fume hood inspected for safety and containment in New Hampshire. And I think we had some good answers already in the chat from other
Okay,
folks on and from LSI.
excellent, outstanding. Thank you, LSI. Appreciate you being here today. And appreciate